the reason why ordinals are so beautiful is they are on Bitcoin L1, so no one can sort of reject it. You can't deny. Like there were some arguments happening that, hey, this is spam or you should censor these things.
Yeah.
And like, look, Bitcoin consensus rules allow this. Like, who are you to say that this thing is invalid because Bitcoin consensus rule allows this, right? The network is actually going to accept it whether you like it or not. And it just proved the point that Bitcoin is open, is permissionless, and people can use it however they want to use it, and no one can do anything about it. So it's a sort of like a very important shift in Bitcoin culture and conversations, and it's attracting a lot of people back to Bitcoin.
Welcome to Good Game, a podcast for crypto insiders with your hosts Imran and Qiao. All right, welcome to Good Game episode 12. And this time around, we're going to be talking about Bitcoin. Qiao, when did you ever think we would ever talk about Bitcoin again?
Never.
Yeah, I mean, I was ready to move on to Ethereum and layer 2s, but here we are talking about Bitcoin.
The funny thing about Bitcoin is, for many people who are in this industry today, their gateway drug was Ethereum. Ethereum is what brought this industry into their lives.
Actually, I've been hearing about Solana being the gateway drug and other layer 2s.
So for the last cycle, the last, bull bear market, it was Solana. The 2017 one was Ethereum. For me, it's always been Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Like, for me, I used to hang out on Bitcoin Talk, and it was really good time. Like, pre-2013 era was really good. Like, people used to talk about dethroning central banks around the world, predating the white paper of Ethereum. My heart has always been with Bitcoin, and my brain has been with Ethereum, if that analogy makes sense to you. Like, for the longest time, like if you talk to 10 VCs within this industry or 10 professionals within this industry, 9.5 of them has written off Bitcoin.
So is it safe to say that your first girlfriend would be Bitcoin and your wife would be Ethereum?
I think that's fair to say. That's the right analogy.
Well, we share the same girlfriend. And that's probably true for many others, right? Bitcoin has always been one of the first gateway drugs for a very long time into crypto, and
still today, I think Bitcoin attracts the most ideologically aligned missionary people. I'm not talking about the Bitcoin maxis. I'm talking about the other developers that are building on top of Bitcoin. But thinking back, like one of the reasons why I think Bitcoin has sort of lost its appeal to a lot of developers over the years, myself included, is I think it's simply the fact that it doesn't have a Turing-complete, highly programmable layer. Part of that was that, and part of that was, the Bitcoin maxis, really turning the newcomers off.
But you could always argue that, it is what makes Bitcoin what it is today, right? Which is this immutable asset that can't be touched or governed, right? And it is always going to be what it is.
It's very reasonable trade-off of ignoring the programmability of Bitcoin and really focusing on the quote-unquote hard money. But all of this has changed in, I want to say, maybe a year and a half ago. So we talk about our applications, Alliance applications, during several episodes, notably in one of the previous episodes on the various layer one, the wars between the layer ones. We talked about how we saw the rise of Solana before anyone else did, just looking at the number of developers applying to our program. And about a year and a half ago, we saw something similar, not to the same extent, of course, but something similar with Stacks. So we saw some really strong builders building on top of Stacks. So that was the thing that got me thinking, okay, there's probably something really interesting going on with Bitcoin. And it's probably something worth looking at because everyone else has written it off. And then sometime within the past year and a half.
And Bitcoin has the best story.
Bitcoin has the best story. Bitcoin has, even today, has $500 billion worth of value that are stored in Bitcoin.
Yeah.
People will want to figure out things to do with Bitcoin by making it programmable. People will want to start trading using Bitcoin in a decentralized fashion. People want to do, perpetual swaps or lending on top of Bitcoin and so on and so forth. And we see like people like David Marcus, the former lead at Facebook DM, which is really mind-boggling for me, by the way. So the guy was working on a programmable layer. Like it was like the total opposite of Bitcoin. Like he took the idea of Ethereum and basically sent it to the extreme. But then he just, abandoned DM and started working on Bitcoin. So that was another really interesting signal. And then you have people like Jack Dorsey started working on decentralized social networks. Obviously, so the name of the protocol is Nostr, and then there's a bunch of applications clients on top of Nostr. But Nostr is not fully like it's not settled on Bitcoin or anything like that, but it does support Lightning Network. And some of the earliest, the critical mass of users on Nostr are also Bitcoin maxis or Bitcoiners. Yep. And that was another really interesting data point. And then Lightning Network was something I just paid attention to from time to time. And it's been growing pretty consistently. So I want to share this chart very quickly here. So this chart is from the blog, but I double checked the data points with other sources. Don't worry about the red line, because the red line is the Lightning Network's capacity denominated in US dollar. And because the price of Bitcoin has gone down, obviously the US dollar amount has gone down. But pay attention to the darker line. I don't know if it's purple or blue, but the darker line is the Lightning Network's capacity denominated in BTC. So in the Ethereum language, it's basically the TVL, right? The TVL on Lightning has been growing very consistently over the past few years. So all these data points, I'm just mentioning all these data points because these are the things over the years that kept me interested in the Bitcoin ecosystem. And that will lead to today's discussion on Ordinals and Stacks.
Yeah, great summary and data points. Like, I think crypto narratives have a history of foregoing and letting go of certain narratives that may have worked in certain times. And so many people have written off Bitcoin within the Ethereum community and general communities as well. And this is probably the best time to pay attention to it, because with Ordinals and other new elements that are being built around the Bitcoin ecosystem, and as you mentioned, $500 billion worth of assets, there's definitely something there. And the question is, how do you bring this to life, and what types of products and features are being built around this so that we can see the increased adoption of Bitcoin and other assets? And so I'll point to like a few interesting tidbits around Ordinals, and we'll probably go into Ordinals much deeper in a bit. Mm-hmm. But high level, it was started by Casey Rodarmer. He's been working on this for over a year now, and he was a Bitcoin core dev, more or less, like just doing basic work versus like more deeper work within the Bitcoin community. And the basic premise of Ordinals is that you could program a Satoshi. There's two elements of Ordinals, right? There's the Ordinal protocol, and then there's inscription. An Ordinal protocol is essentially a convention that anyone can opt into, whereby a UTXO contains just fungible sats. And within this, you can name this from a 0 to 100, or you could number them from 0 to whatever. So the Ordinal protocol will take each Satoshi and will create a naming convention for each Satoshi. That's all it does. And then you have the second element, which is the inscriptions. And what inscriptions does is it allows anyone to upload arbitrary data. It could be a link, it could be a picture, anything that can return from a web server query. And what you could do here is you could add images up to 4 megabytes under, if you look at the block construction within Bitcoin, there's something called the witness section, which is where people can add data.
That's the witness from the famous or the infamous SegWit from back in the day, 2017, I believe. I actually don't know the technical details, but
yeah.
Why don't you walk through the technical details behind SegWit?
Yeah, I think SegWit means segregated witness. Mm-hmm. You can call it a blob space, as Eric has from Eric Wells on Twitter, which is like a high amount of data that can be used for anything that you want, right? It's just a blob of space. And so this was created, but there hasn't been any use of it. And then recently with Taproot being approved, then you have the expansion of 4 megabytes.
So Taproot, just for our audience, the Taproot is another quote unquote major upgrade.
Yeah.
On Bitcoin, which happened like a year and a half
about
ago?
A year ago.
A year ago.
Yeah. Yeah. So Ordinals really happened based on these two things, which is segregated witness, and then which created the blob space, and then the Taproot, which kind of expanded the memory. Before this, if people wanted to add any data to the Bitcoin block space, you only had about 80 bytes of space, which is very, very low.
And that was within the OP return?
That's within OP return. And we could talk about the OP return wars then. It might probably a good segue into that, which is ultimately like OP return wars. What does that mean? Well, OP return wars was really two camps that were fighting about whether or not data should be inscribed within the Bitcoin block space at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. And so before OP return was created, which I'll talk about what that means, was that people would store data on Bitcoin using something called output script pub key. Mm-hmm. And so when someone would add data to this would get mined on the block, and it would charge a transaction fee and get mined on the block, etc. What it does is the Bitcoin blockchain would see this as a traditional financial transaction. So people that weren't really using Bitcoin as a way to transact, but people were using it as a way to store data. Mm-hmm. And so what that ended up doing was creating a lot of bloat. And the Bitcoin community and the Bitcoin core dev community hated that.
And it's exactly what's happening recently with Ordinals. Like the Bitcoin maxis hate Ordinals because it's actually bloating the block space.
Yes. I actually went down some interesting Bitcoin community talks. Mm-hmm. Felt a little dirty because they kept talking about shitcoin peddlers and, and so it was, and so you have to take this with a very neutral state of mind when you're listening to these conversations.
By the way, whenever Bitcoin maxis hate something, whatever thing that they hate becomes interesting to me. That was the case originally with Ethereum. They all hated Ethereum back then, 2014, 2016, and now they're hating on Ordinals. That's what led to our deep dive into Ordinals. But anyway, sorry. OP return. So OP return was back in the day, really back in the day, like maybe 10 years ago or something like that.
10 years ago.
10 years ago. Mm-hmm. And OP return was a way for people to store data, arbitrary data on the Bitcoin blockchain. And then what happened? Because it sounds like Ordinals is actually not the first attempt at NFTs on Bitcoin. Like NFTs actually existed a long time ago on Bitcoin. Actually, in fact, well before the birth of Ethereum, and let alone the birth of the ERC 721 standard. So what's the history there?
Yeah, just for our audience to know, the reason why we're talking about OP return wars and why it's important to talk about how data was being stored on the Bitcoin's blockchain is what will be the eventual rise of NFTs and others, which we'll talk a bit about. So the Bitcoin core dev community came together and they said, okay, let's come up with something where it's a lighter weight data point that you can add up to 80 bytes. And the way we could do this is we'll create a output script whereby the output is unspendable. So when the transaction gets mined, then the Bitcoin protocol protocol would know that this isn't actually like a financial transaction, right? And so what it does is through a process of pruning, it creates a faster way for this to be mined, the transaction to be mined. And it doesn't create bloat because the Bitcoin protocol knows to take financial transactions as priority over transactions that just have data, arbitrary data, as an example. Mm-hmm. And so that created some openness to allow for some experimentation because there was two camps at the time. One that wanted to try something cool, which also included Vitalik. Uh-huh. And then the other camp, which was the hardcore Bitcoin community that didn't want anything to happen with the Bitcoin protocol.
And that is what is known today as the Bitcoin Maxi community.
Yes. And so with this, we're starting to see a lot of cool experimentation.
Let me guess.
Yeah.
Color coins.
Yes, colored coins. And this led to colored coins, the rise of colored coins. I think you were part of that, right? That when you saw that live, right? So do you maybe want to add a couple points to that, or I can kind of go through?
I mean, very high level, colored coins is just the original Bitcoin version of ERC20.
Yep.
But if I recall correctly, people also experimented non-fungible tokens with colored coins. I can't remember the exact terminology. Maybe it was a different terminology. But rare PayPays and some other original Bitcoin NFTs from back in the day was actually in the form of colored coins. And due to the limitations, if I remember, related to the colored coins, notably the lack of programmability or the lack of high-level programmability, was one thing that really led Vitalik to start Ethereum back in 2014. Like Vitalik was highly involved with colored coins, and he realized that Bitcoin was just not good enough for doing all the cool experiments.
So colored coins was initially brought up by a person named Yoni Asya, who is the founder of eToro.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, back in 2012. And then he got together with Vitalik Buterin and Manny Rosenfeld, and they came up with the white paper in 2013 called Colored Coins. And colored coins, as you mentioned, is the ERC20 for Bitcoin. And the idea was pretty simple, which is like similar to what I've mentioned earlier with the OP return wars, which is adding arbitrary data. So you could tell what Bitcoin is colored versus not. And you would obviously need a wallet that could view these colored coins so that you could add images or other things to the data here. So this whole rise of colored coins kind of came about. And the way you want to think about color coins also is that it was like the first actual experiment to see whether or not, and even back then they were talking about issuing commodities, issuing equities using colored coins.
It's not a new idea. It's not something that Ethereum came up with, but Ethereum was the one that executed on it.
That's absolutely right. But what really led to their downfall, I think, was the fact that OP return was primarily like, the Bitcoin community didn't want three things. One was 80 bytes isn't enough. Vitalik needed more flexibility in terms of like, smart contracts and other things that can be built around this use case. And then I think finally it's the Bitcoin community wasn't really open to this idea. Probably, I mean, maybe back then, rightfully so, maybe not. They wanted to just really focus on the security hardness of Bitcoin in itself. And then that's fine. And we'll come back to why that could be important today with the launch of Ordinals. But that's the high level of like the rise of colored coins, the downfall of colored coins. And I'll add one more area, which is rare Pepes, which you and I just talked about recently, which is rare. The first NFT was released on Bitcoin through a layer 2 called Counterparty.
Yeah. Remember that?
Yeah, if you remember that. And Counterparty is similar where it embeds data into the Bitcoin transaction. And Counterparty has this layer 2 where the nodes aren't peer-to-peer per se, but they're used as a way to conduct transactions. And you could view with the wallet which coins have been altered as a way to issue the NFT is the basic way to think about it. But then they also opened up to Ethereum. So they launched many rare Pepes on Ethereum. And so they've been kind of agnostic in regards to using layer 1s as a means to issue their NFTs. But that's kind of the high level of all of this. But looking deep into why can't Bitcoin be programmable? And it, I think, comes back to like the UTXO and account model. And what is UTXO? What does it stand for? Unspent transaction outputs.
Okay. I think the best way to explain UTXO is more in the form of an analogy. So you can view the Bitcoin transaction as just people sending checks to each other. Okay. So let's say I write you a $100 check, and then you write a $50 check to someone else. In the Ethereum case, Ethereum does not track these two transactions as two unique things. Like Ethereum will look at your account balance and say that after the two transactions, your net account balance is 50, right? So you get 100 and then you spend 50. And then Ethereum will track your account balance as 50, right? But in the case of Bitcoin, because it's checks, it's two different checks, and every check actually has a unique identity on it. a lot of you are probably like Gen Z, you've never seen a check, but for boomers like us, every check actually has a unique ID attached to it. So if in this system we only pay each other using checks, okay, then every check that you got from me and then you end up spending and give to someone else can be traced back to the original issuer of that check, which is me. So the result of that is Bitcoin is actually not completely fungible. And this was one of the main criticisms that people had against Bitcoin in terms of privacy is that Bitcoin, one BTC is actually not one BTC. Okay. You can trace every single BTC, every single Satoshi that you own all the way back to the Coinbase transaction. And the way you calculate your balance is you take all the transactions that come in, you aggregate that, and you subtract all the transactions that go out from that number to get a net balance. But in reality, at the most basic level, the system does not track account balance. It tracks all these individual transactions. And this is the key difference between the Bitcoin UTXO system and the Ethereum account system. And why this is important, well, you can explain. This is important because this is what enables ordinals. This is what enables non-fungible tokens at the layer 1 without a new token standard.
Yeah, I mean, you've explained it well. U2XL is just essentially like a database, right, of party A, party B, and then you get to see where transactions from the start of the Coinbase. And for those that don't know what the term Coinbase means, Coinbase essentially means a new Bitcoin that's generated by securing the Bitcoin network. That's what Coinbase means. And Coinbase now is referred to an exchange. But back in those days, Coinbase was relative to like new coins being issued on the Bitcoin network.
So Imran, we laid out a lot of the history and the background knowledge.
Yeah.
And we've done there's a reason why we did that is because all of that history and background is critical to understanding ordinals. Because one of the key questions, one of the key things that you probably realize is that ordinals is not the first attempt at NFTs on Bitcoin.
Yep.
It existed a while ago. But why now? Why is all of a sudden everyone talking about ordinals?
I think it's a combination of a few things. One is I think Bitcoin is still viewed as the premier asset in the asset class of all of crypto. Two is the ability to inscribe data and then like using the naming convention as a way to assign a Satoshi to that data, which is also very interesting because if you think about like the way we store data today, here's a great example on the Ethereum network, is that data is primarily stored. Let's take a look at NFTs. The picture of the NFT is usually stored on either IPFS or Arweave, right? Yeah. And both of those have their own security parameters in place, right? Like it's often known that IPFS loses your pictures.
That's right.
And so you got to use Pinata as a way to, and this is, I'm getting too technical here, but uses a way to pin that data so that there's redundancy of that picture on other computers or nodes. And the kind of cool thing about ordinals is that, and Ethereum has done this with autoglyphs and others where you can actually store the picture on chain. But ordinals, you could store all the arbitrary data related to that JPEG onto the Satoshi, right? You can inscribe that metadata, which is cool. And I'd say that's like one thing that I found that to be very, like second thing that I thought that to be very interesting is that you can actually store the data on chain and it's there forever.
And the key thing is before ordinals, or more specifically, before SegWit and Taproot, you could only store 80 kilobytes?
80 bytes.
But now you can store up to 4 megabytes. So you can actually store an entire image of a JPEG, of a visual NFT on the layer 1 blockchain itself. This is not possible before, during the first few attempts at NFTs on Bitcoin. And this is something that the Ethereum community is not doing today because the vast majority of NFTs, the metadata is stored on Arweave and IPFS. So this is what makes ordinals really cool, is that you only need to rely on the security assumptions of Bitcoin rather than a third-party storage system. So the technical part is part of the reasons why ordinals are happening now. But I think there's another softer but social reason is that at the time of the first attempts at NFTs on Bitcoin, NFTs was not really a commonly accepted thing. Like people weren't comfortable with the idea of NFTs. Like 2021 was really the year that the entire world got comfortable with this idea of NFTs, digitally stored non-fungible tokens. And so there's really a social element there where people are now comfortable with this idea, and people really need this new phenomenon of NFTs to bring developer activity back onto the Bitcoin blockchain.
There's a lot of interesting dynamics at play here. I love talking and brainstorming about what could happen, right? Now that every arbitrary data that's imputed on the Bitcoin network, that has some sort of value that's tied to it, which I find to be interesting. I don't know. There could be something there where any data you put that's linked to a Satoshi could have some data. Maybe it's not worth anything to anyone, but maybe it's worth something to someone. And that essentially creates more on-chain activity or financialization of data on-chain.
Yeah.
I saw certain examples as like private public key rotation as well as a use case. And I saw a couple other use cases, which...
The Bitcoin naming service?
Bitcoin naming service?
That's a big one, right? Like the .btc name, domain names.
Who wouldn't want .btc?
Exactly.
So I think we're just starting to like scratch the surface of what could be done here. And then you think about it and you're like, okay, well, if all of this could happen, what could be built on Bitcoin, right?
Yep.
And that led us to our journey of looking into like what is around the Bitcoin ecosystem, what layer 2s are being built around it. So there's like Lightning and Stacks. We're going to have Muneeb on soon to talk a bit about Stacks. And really like, what is the future of Bitcoin, right? Because right now, the biggest worry for Bitcoin has been, at least for me, and I think for you too as well,
is the fee market.
It's the fee market, exactly.
That's right.
Like Coinbase, when I say Coinbase is like new coins are generated, aren't going to be enough for miners to continue to secure the network. Over time, every 4 years, there's a halvening where the incentives are cut in half. And so over time, miners have to rely on transactions on the Bitcoin network to continue to extract value so it can continue to run its operations. And right now, no one really uses Bitcoin outside of just sending money back and forth. And that doesn't happen very often because confirmation times are long or et cetera, et cetera. But with this, it's starting to create a fee market and more demand for the block space. And this could be a way to secure the network in the long run.
This is something that Bitcoin maxis are either ignorant about or dishonest about, because without the fee market, without the security, you won't have a hard money in the long run. Like people will not even trust your security. Like today, I think Ethereum actually has better security than Bitcoin because of the fees that are being paid by all these users of applications.
That's right.
There's a chart I really want to share.
Yeah, sure.
To show why Ordinals is a big deal for this security of Bitcoin, which is this chart here. This is a really surprising chart for me. And this chart shows the average block size of Bitcoin. So this spike here, this recent spike, is Ordinals, is people inscribing data onto the blockchain through the Ordinal protocol, people creating NFTs, people creating, Bitcoin domain names, creating visual NFTs, and so on and so forth. And before this Ordinals phenomenon, the average block size was maybe around slightly over 1 megabyte. And now it's at 2 megabytes. And so
it's crazy.
This is a big deal because, obviously the demand for block space has not been, so from the data that we've seen, the demand for block space has not been reflected in the fee market yet, but the trend is there. People want more block space on the Bitcoin blockchain. And this is a really big deal. Now, the pushback that a lot of people have is, well, I just never see people developing on top of Bitcoin. Like, who's building on top of Bitcoin? Who's building applications on top of, Bitcoin or Stacks or whatever? And I want to show this other data point from Electric Capital's famous developer activity report. And this is the most recent data point from early 2023. So in total, I think there may be 7,000 full-time developers building in various crypto ecosystems. Ethereum is by far number one, but even then it's only 1,800 or maybe around 20%. That's a pretty surprising number to me. But the most important data point that I want to point out here is that Bitcoin, surprisingly, is number 5.
Still up there.
It's still up there. It's ahead of Polygon. Maybe they have a interesting methodology, but regardless, this number is pretty surprising to me. So Bitcoin is only behind Ethereum, Polkadot, Cosmos, Solana, the usual suspects, and before Polygon. This is a really encouraging number for the Bitcoin ecosystem. And we haven't even talked about Stacks yet.
Yeah.
The real smart contract scaling solution for Bitcoin.
And maybe we could talk about Lightning as well before we bring Muneeb on, so we can kind of lay out the picture of what Lightning is. Lightning essentially is like a payment channel. You could think of it like a bidirectional payment channel. So two parties can open a channel where one party, and this is within the Bitcoin network. And so whatever happens within the payment channel then goes up the chain and settles on the Bitcoin network. So you could think of these as like two people that want to transact with each other. There's some assets on one side, and the person on the other side want to transact with each other, like with the person with the counterparty. So transaction happens, right? And once the transaction is like finalized, it then gets settled onto the Bitcoin network, is the best way to explain it. And the basic idea here is that Bitcoin, Lightning is essentially a scaling for payments, which enables like cheaper, faster payments in a trustless way. And it uses like kind of like the peer-to-peer design as a way to do this globally. So an example of that on Lightning's website they mentioned was, ultimately, if you want to use Lightning Network and you want to transact with person B, the Lightning Network will find its route to this person B using the Lightning Network. And so this is supposed to create like kind of like an off-chain kind of way for people to arbitrarily like transact, and then using Bitcoin as still the security layer as a way to settle the transactions.
And by the way, on that note, there's a lot of controversy on what is really a layer 2 on top of Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Based on my research, Lightning is, at least according to the Ethereum community's definition of a layer 2, Lightning is the only layer 2. Due to the limitations of the layer 1 blockchain on Bitcoin, Stacks is not really a layer 2 according to the Ethereum community. But it's a question that we're going to ask Muneeb about how he thinks about these things. But if we use the broadest sense of the word layer 2, there's basically only 2 layer 2s that really matter today on Bitcoin.
Yeah.
The Lightning Network and the Stacks network. One is entirely exclusively for payment, that's Lightning. And the other one is more general purpose, highly programmable smart contract platform. And that is Stacks.
Cool. Welcome, Muneeb, to Good Game. There's been a lot of excitement around Ordinals and what could be the future of Bitcoin. And so maybe before we get started, a quick background on yourself and a bit about Stacks.
First of all, thanks for having me. Some background on myself. I basically did a PhD in computer science at Princeton. When I was wrapping up there is when I discovered Bitcoin around 2013, I believe. It was trading at around $80. I started becoming really fascinated with the technology, took a deep dive into it, and it's been a rabbit hole since, right? So I have tried building protocols and applications like back in the days, like directly on Bitcoin L1. So I have learned from how hard that is and how hard it is to scale Bitcoin, or how hard it is to program using just a Bitcoin script and so on. And I think that's where the Stacks layer was sort of born from that experience. So 2017 is when the Stacks project started. It was in R&D. We were building a more secure programming language. We were trying to figure out how to basically have Bitcoin layers that can have consensus with Bitcoin L1. And we can get into more details of how that works. And the biggest thing that we are sort of working on right now is unlocking BTC liquidity. Like, can people easily take their BTC from the L1 into the Stacks layer and back in a decentralized way? So that is the bulk of the focus these days in the ecosystem.
Great. There has been some controversy before we talk about Ordinals about building on the Bitcoin ecosystem. Specifically, obviously, if you think about UTXOs, they're probably very hard to build on top of. And so that was probably the genesis to what Ethereum is now today. And so the question is like, why the focus on Bitcoin, one, and why is there so much controversy in building around the Bitcoin ecosystem?
Yeah, great question. So I think let me get into the first question. That hey, why are you building on Bitcoin? So it was actually like a clear thing to do back in 2013, 2014. Nothing else was around, right? Like I've seen the birth of Ethereum in front of me. A lot of people might think that I'm a Bitcoin maximalist. I'm actually not. I participated in the Ethereum Genesis ICO. Like I have backed like several projects of my friends in the industry, like Filecoin and others. So I still keep most of my own personal holdings in Bitcoin, and I have my reasons for it. Like I view it as a less risky asset. I think it has the best shot of actually becoming sound money in the world. And so my reason for building on Bitcoin is actually very sort of like different, right? Like my background is distributed systems, internet protocols. And if you look at how the internet evolved, there were several competing designs back in the day. And the one that really worked was that had a very, very simple base layer, TCP/IP. It just does one thing, and it does that one thing really, really well. It takes packets from one endpoint to the other, and that's it. I think if you look at all the various systems, Bitcoin remains the most simple protocol at the base layer. And it tries to optimize for decentralization. And I do think decentralization matters a lot. Bitcoin, I'll give you some examples. And it optimizes for durability, right? So the example would be that you could be pretty much anywhere in the world with a normal internet connection, with a normal hardware, even a Raspberry Pi, and you can actually run a full Bitcoin node. I think that is very important, that anyone can independently verify what the state of the chain is and so on. And the more important thing actually is that you could actually download a Bitcoin client from literally 2013 and try to sync it from Genesis, and that client will work. So if you forgot to upgrade your node for the last 10 years, that thing is actually still valid and it still works. Right? So there's a sense of like durability that this thing is around and this thing is going to stay around. That is, I just find really, really appealing, because to me, decentralization is the only metric that sort of matters. And the simplicity of the base protocol is something that I find very attractive. The flip side of that is that because of the simplicity and because of this resistance to change, developers can't really build much on Bitcoin. So it's basically two sides of the same thing, right? Like on one side, like that is the benefit. And because of the same properties, developers would have a much harder time trying to build a Bitcoin versus more expressive or programmable systems like Ethereum, or even the culture, right? Like you can do hard forks and make changes like much more frequently in systems like Ethereum, Solana, Avalanche, and so on. So that's the challenge I think that we've been trying to solve, that if there can be Bitcoin layers that can be more experimental, they can actually upgrade much faster than Bitcoin L1. In fact, the Stacks project has this almost like a design rule that we can never ask for a feature from Bitcoin L1, because that just means that it's going to take 3 to 5 years to ship, if it ever ships, right? So everything that you're doing, you basically assume zero support from L1, and that's a hard thing to do, right? And so coming to the challenges part, I think one thing is just technical challenges. Like technically speaking, if your core L1 chain is not supporting you, almost like explicitly, right? You're saying, hey, I would love to have this feature, and my feature for moving BTC capital from L1 to the layer would actually become more trustless that way if you just have this small change, like give me one opcode, and people are going to say no by default, right? Like that's one challenge. I think the other challenge is actually cultural challenge. Like between 2013 to, I would say, 2016 or so, there used to be a culture of builders around Bitcoin. People were sort of like more intellectually curious. And both during the block size wars that happened in 2017, and there were other outlets, there were other ecosystems like Ethereum and others that came that sort of attracted those intellectually curious people who wanted to just tinker around, build new things. And Bitcoin between 2017 to, I would say, 2021, 2022 has been this sort of like high level, theoretical ideas, mostly around sound money that are being discussed. there isn't a much of a culture of like devs actually doing interesting things. And I think one of the reasons why I'm so excited about Ordinals and some of the other recent developments is that culture is changing, that vibe is changing, right? Like devs are coming back and they're discovering why Bitcoin is important. And for people like me and some others who basically just stuck around, even if, the overall culture was sort of like in some ways even hostile to developers, right now we're in a great position to capitalize on all of that interest.
Muneeb, just to add to what you just said there, I've never talked to you, but I know you from Twitter, and I have immense respect for you because all these years you've gone through, you face all that hostility and the lack of support from the layer one and the hostility from the Bitcoin maxis, and yet you stuck around. You continue to be committed to Bitcoin and building now Stacks, which is essentially a layer 2 on top of Bitcoin. I have no words to express how much respect I have for that, especially given what you said there around 2014, 2016 when Ethereum came around, and then you start seeing developers leaving the Bitcoin community for the Ethereum community as well. So all that to say, I'm very happy to talk to you today about Stacks.
Absolutely. I would say I'm not alone, right? There is a small community of developers and people in the Bitcoin ecosystem that share the same values. And we also get our inspiration from the early days of Bitcoin. So it's a little bit like if you were there in 2012, 2013, and you actually experienced the initial Bitcoin culture, that was very different, right? And we remember it. We lived through that time. And we were sort of like puzzled for a while that what happened, like who are these new people? Why have they taken over, this project and so on? But we sort of like stuck around. So there are these Telegram groups of actual folks who have been sort of like a support system, right? Like because you could talk to them about, hey, this is not how things used to be. NFTs sort of like started on Bitcoin through Counterparty. Like a lot of these colored coins and ideas, they started on Bitcoin. So in some ways, it was kind of like going back to the culture that we loved, and you just like Bitcoin enough. There's also a pretty interesting division that the builders and the users of Bitcoin are actually pretty open-minded. These folks don't even do much with Bitcoin, right? Like they don't actually use the network and they don't actually use any of the tooling. They just sort of like the idea, and it's almost like a religion around Bitcoin, right? It's not really, it's not even Bitcoin, the technology and the tool. It's a religion around Bitcoin, which in some ways has its own place, right? Like they're trying to convert more people to the religion and so on. And that's fine. I don't think that matters. What matters is we're interested in Bitcoin, the open source project, Bitcoin, the tool, Bitcoin, the technology, and how you can use it. And I think the reason why Ordinals are so beautiful is they are on Bitcoin L1, so no one can sort of reject it. You can't deny. Like there were some arguments happening that, hey, this is spam or you should censor these things. Yeah. And like, look, Bitcoin consensus rules allow this. Like, who are you to say that this thing is invalid because Bitcoin consensus rule allows this, right? The network is actually going to accept it whether you like it or not. And it just proved the point that Bitcoin is open, is permissionless, and people can use it however they want to use it, and no one can do anything about it. So it's a sort of like a very important shift in Bitcoin culture and conversations, and it's attracting a lot of people back to Bitcoin. Like I've been on so many Twitter spaces where folks are like, hey, I actually got introduced to the industry through Bitcoin, still love it. I keep a bunch of my assets in Bitcoin, but there isn't much for me to do. So I play around with NFTs and DeFi protocols and other systems and spend the majority of my time there. And I'm so excited that there are interesting things for me to do back in Bitcoin. I think I'm hearing that story like again and again.
So Muneeb, before you joined this call, Imran and I gave our thoughts and overview of Ordinals and why it's a big deal. But we want to hear independently from you, what is Ordinals for you? Like quickly, how would you describe Ordinals and why it's such a big deal for Bitcoin?
Yes. So I think it's a very clever system, right? Like if you go and read the ordinal theory, it's sort of like captivating because what it's doing is it's trying to say that instead of thinking of Satoshis, which is the smallest unit for a Bitcoin, you can try to sequence them, and some of the Satoshis might be more rare than others. And the ordinal theory just came up with one type of sequencing. Again, you can think of like other types of sequencing as well, but it just plants that idea that here is one type of sequencing that we are interested in. And then they came up with the idea of an inscription, which is effectively writing some sort of a data in a transaction directly to the Bitcoin L1 that would be associated with that Satoshi, right? And it just gives you a different lens for looking at the same thing. Like it's the same Bitcoin, same like 21 million Bitcoin, but it just sort of like creates a rank or so some sort of an order for different Satoshis, and then the idea of like being able to inscribe, right? So I think the terms are also pretty intelligent, the way they're used in the Ordinals project, because they sort of like differentiate it from NFTs, right? The idea of inscribing, I actually love that term because that's sort of like saying you're writing something permanently. It's like writing on concrete or something, right? Like, and people get that feeling the first time I use it, the first time I just uploaded a file, the feeling I was getting is that, this thing might be there even after I'm dead, right? Like Bitcoin is sort of like indestructible. Like think of it this way, if something really bad happens to Bitcoin, there's a good probability that the rest of the industry might not also survive. Right?
Yeah.
But inverse, like if really bad things happen to the rest of the industry and Bitcoin still survives, like that can still happen. Like at this point in time, like I'm not saying that this will always be the case or something like that, right? Like if Bitcoin doesn't keep kind of like its lead and so on and keep attracting developers, it's possible that something else becomes more interesting. I don't think I'm religious in that view, but for now, like that is the reality. Bitcoin is by far the biggest asset and the most decentralized and durable thing out there, and it's optimized for that. So I think that's why with Ordinals, like especially for NFTs, people really like the idea of like, look, I don't have to trust anything other than Bitcoin as long as Bitcoin lives. So the same arguments for why your BTC is valuable directly apply to an NFT that is directly on Bitcoin L1. If you think that this thing is durable, it's as durable as BTC itself. If you think that being early actually means something, like there's a Bitcoin block in which something was registered, so you could actually tell time. And you would be able to tell time 10 years from now when someone would say, like, this was the original thing that was published back then. And I think people like sort of really got drawn to it. And there have been similar ideas, not exactly the same, but counterparty was NFTs on Bitcoin L1. They weren't sort of like storing images. But I think there's something about the way the Ordinals project came out. It was so intellectually interesting that it just struck a nerve with people, and people just couldn't stop talking about it. And I think that also matters. Like there has to be a cultural interest and sort of like use of the product that just didn't really happen earlier. Like things were technically possible, but they just never crossed sort of like that inflection point. And I think Ordinals have sort of like already crossed that. And I think that means that this thing might be here to stay.
I like how you describe Ordinals as a cultural shift in how the world views Bitcoin, or specifically how developers view Bitcoin. And you tweeted a few days ago that Ordinals is a Trojan horse that can take Bitcoin to 1 billion people. So the implication of that is there has to be some interesting use cases, right? What are some of the most interesting use cases or applications that are built on top of the Ordinals protocol that you've seen so far?
Yeah, so I think that tweet, like a big reason behind it is simply NFTs. Like the last bull market, you guys might have these numbers like better than me. But to me, it seems like a lot of the new users were actually onboarded because of NFTs. In fact, this might be actually the first cycle that I've seen. So I've seen 3. I think this might be the first cycle where maybe the onboarding wasn't happening through Bitcoin as much as maybe even NFTs, where people were directly sort of like discovering stuff.
That's right.
And NFTs was the first thing that they were seeing. I've seen some stats from hardware wallet sales number. I think a lot of the hardware wallets were actually being sold because people wanted to keep NFTs there. So I think that was one reason behind that. Is sort of like a Trojan horse. People are discovering NFTs. Bitcoin NFTs could be a pretty big thing that they want to discover. And the process of actually getting a Bitcoin NFT is very, very interesting. So I'll give you a little background on Taproot. Right? So the Bitcoin hasn't had major upgrades in a very, very long time. SegWit was many years ago. That was one upgrade. And again, these are, in the grand scheme of things, like pretty narrowly focused, tight things like that are basically optimizing space on chain and how signatures are done and so on. And Taproot was similar. Like it does some privacy enhancements, some space efficiency, and some people thought like this is like smart contracts. You might have seen marketing material around it. It's nothing close to like having an EVM or a full execution environment on Bitcoin. That just doesn't exist. But yes, it enables slightly more advanced scripting in a more efficient manner on chain. And Taproot went live and basically nothing happened. If you look at the graph, like nothing happened. Like Taproot adoption was, I don't know, below 1% or something like that for a while. It's been live for like almost a year or more. And then Ordinals comes around. And if you look at these graphs, and I'll send them to you, maybe you can link it in the notes, like it's basically skyrocketing. The Taproot adoption is skyrocketing. People are scrambling. Wallets are scrambling. Other services are scrambling to actually integrate Taproot. I'll tell you about two companies in the Stacks ecosystem. One is Xverse. It's a mobile wallet that released a web extension as well. Those people weren't sleeping, right? They saw so much demand, and they upgraded to Taproot, like in their wallet, with Ordinals encryption support. So now imagine that a web wallet actually has a reason to integrate with Taproot, right? Like when initially I was trying to use Ordinals, I realized that even Electrum, the OG wallet, like didn't support Taproot, or at least my version doesn't. And so it's things like that, right? Like it's user demand that results in dev tooling, that results in better UX wallets at other places that just Bitcoin wasn't getting. Right? So all the criticism that we would receive from Ethereum communities or Solana or other places, in some ways, some of the criticism is valid. And I would say the same thing back to those communities, that some of the criticism that Bitcoiners have, forgetting about like, some of the toxic folks over there about decentralization and how truly decentralized Bitcoin is and so on, like that is also true. Right? So the reality is always somewhere in the middle. And I think with the Stacks layer, the interesting thing is that we have a community that is self-aware enough that yes, dev tools are pretty bad in Bitcoin, but we see that as an opportunity, that there are dev tooling companies that are trying to basically fix that. There are people who are trying to bring really good UX to Bitcoin web wallets. Like there's no good Bitcoin web wallet, or at least wasn't there until the Hero wallet or Xverse sort of like came around. So I actually think that in some ways we could be a bridge between like Bitcoin and the rest of the crypto industry, and sort of like try to bring the best of both worlds.
I know we haven't talked much about it, but the initial release of Stacks in 2021 allowed settlement of BTC, right? And maybe we could talk about what that means. You introduced the clarity language and being able to atomically swap BTC assets via SBTC. So maybe could you touch on those 3 points and how you bridge the gap between, people that just hold Bitcoin? And I believe there's $500 billion with the Bitcoin. And how do you bridge the gap into this like world of smart contracts and all the other things that are being built on Stacks?
Yeah, basically, how does Stacks work?
Yeah,
happy to, right? So I think going back to this time, so 2017 is around when the project started, raised some capital. And one of the main things we worked on was a new programming language that is basically optimized for safety, right? So it's a decidable language. What that means is that even before running the contract, you know exactly what the contract can or cannot do, which I think is a very nice property.
Is that the same thing as formal verification, or is that a different concept?
Formal verification is a slightly different concept, but being decidable makes formal verification a lot easier. Right? So think of this as, all of you imagine like a control path, that what possible paths the program can take. With the decidable language, you know exactly what those paths are, and you know them even before you execute anything. So you can actually do much more rigorous analysis beforehand. It's possible to do like a formal verification for a full Turing complete language as well. It's just harder, right? And you would have to spend a lot more resources on a very particular contract versus having a more generic, easier path to doing these things.
So the programming language for Stacks is not Turing complete. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. So the way I usually describe it, that if you think of Turing complete as the largest set, meaning with a Turing complete language, anything you can think of, you can program, right? You're not limited by anything. And what Bitcoin has, like the limited scripts, has a very, very small thing in the middle that you're very narrowly defining a very few opcodes that you could do. The decidable language are basically very close to Turing complete. There's some things that are sort of like not there, but practically speaking, basically any program you can write in Solidity, you can also write in Clarity. Clarity. And I'm not just saying that theoretically. We have actually done hackathons. We'll take popular Solidity contracts, and people would write them in Clarity, and they were easily able to do it. So you do give up on some expressiveness, but you gain a lot more in security, right? And being able to analyze things. And then there are other interesting features of Clarity where, for example, the source code is published at the blockchain level. And there are these post conditions, which you can even see in the wallet, where the language basically says, I don't care about what the logic of the contract was. In the end, this is exactly what is happening. So you can specify something like, no more than 100 Satoshis could be taken from my wallet. I don't care about the rest of the logic. And if the post condition is not true, the call will fail. And it also presents a very interesting user experience to the users, because for the first time, you can actually, developers can actually see the code. It's not compiled code that is floating around, but the actual code. And then it's very readable. Right? So you can actually tell your users interesting things so that they don't accidentally do something.
Is the idea behind Clarity being non-Turing complete is more security, as you mentioned, compared to, let's say, Ethereum? Because with Ethereum being Turing complete, there's other attack vectors like infinite loops or reentrancy attacks. So generally speaking, when someone's launching on Stacks, what's the likelihood of vulnerability attacks or attacks that commonly happen on Ethereum?
Yeah, great question, right? So I think there's nuance to it. So for example, yes, high level, that is true. And that reentrancy is not possible. Some of the other things that developers can hurt themselves with is not possible. With that said, it's a programming language. It's not magic, right? If you write buggy code, you can hurt yourself. So the way I sort of describe is the attack surface is much smaller, right? So the probability of you accidentally hurting yourself is actually smaller, but that doesn't mean that, you still need to get audits. You still need to make sure that your code actually does what it's supposed to do and so on. It's sort of like a more precise tool that would help you not accidentally cut yourself, right? And I think some developers who have used it, now there are, thousands of contracts published on the Stacks that are using Clarity. People who have actually used it, I know I'm biased, but they love it. They go I get it. I get it why you are optimizing for safety, because at the end of the day, especially in DeFi, you're keeping real money on a computer program. Something like that has never happened in the history of programming before, right? So all the other dimensions that, hey, it should be easy to program, it should be fast, or it should be secure, I think we're just picking one. We're saying, look, security is the thing that we are optimizing for. And people sort of go it makes sense, right? The thing that I'm losing my sleep on is if there's $100 million in my contract, I don't want that to disappear. And I'm willing to, learn this other language. I'm willing to give up on maybe some other things hey, how easy it is to program. Even though Clarity is pretty easy, people who have used Lisp, they feel like it's just like using Lisp.
Muneeb, I want to talk a little bit or understand a little bit more about the security and the consensus of Stacks, because on Twitter there's a lot of people I saw you tweet about Stacks as a layer 2 of Bitcoin, and then there's always a lot of controversy, a lot of people questioning that definition. Obviously the Ethereum community uses a different definition of layer 2 as your definition, but my sense from my research is that Stacks does not have as strong of a security assumptions as Ethereum layer 2s like Optimism and Arbitrum and ZK rollups. But it feels stronger, or at least as strong as something like Polygon, which is more of a sidechain. But that's my perception. How does consensus and security work on Stacks, and how does that compare to the Ethereum rollups?
It's a great question, and I think maybe it's worth spending a little bit time on it. So the first thing I would say is, in the Bitcoin community, imagine the term L2 was there even before Ethereum even existed, right? So there's a little bit of I know that the industry has evolved, and now there are much kind of more precise definitions. But sometimes when we were talking to our core audience, like the Bitcoin community, people used to talk about L2s. I think Adam Beck still in conversations calls Liquid a Bitcoin L2. You can go to their Twitter and you'll see that the Liquid Twitter calls itself a Bitcoin L2. Liquid is a federated sidechain, right? And in the Bitcoin community, like people have this mental model of like, there's Bitcoin, which is the L1, and anything sort of like you build on top is like L2. And I actually agree with, I was having this conversation with Toli from Solana, and I actually agree with them that I think it's a much more precise definition that Ethereum has, but I think there's nuance, and let me get into it. So first of all, most of the times I call stacks a Bitcoin layer. I just use a very generic term. I try to just not even get into the differences. That's the term used in the technical papers. That's the term that we prefer, because I think obviously we don't want to claim something that's not, right? So if at least some people, let's say outside of Bitcoin, they're going to take L2 to mean something else, we don't want to think that it has some properties that it doesn't have. Right? So the key difference effectively is that the Ethereum definition basically falls down to this key point, that if you can move your assets from L1 into the L2, and when you're withdrawing it back, you're basically only dependent on Ethereum security. There's no set of keys outside that need to sign something, then that's a true L2. And I actually absolutely agree with that definition. And I think rollups are sort of like the best example of that, right? Like the security is basically the L1 security over there. And sidechains are sort of like they have a different security budget. So according to that definition, you cannot claim that is true for Stacks, because the BTC that you're moving from Bitcoin L1 into Stacks, on the way back, there is a decentralized group of signers, but they are not the Bitcoin miners. Right? So there's a different decentralized group of signers who are signing on the peg out. So over there, that would fail. But where it becomes tricky is that Stacks also fails all of the definitions of a sidechain as well. Right? So you can't say it's a sidechain either, because sidechains typically have, at least in the Bitcoin world, a subset of Bitcoin's hash power that secures it. In the version of Stacks that's coming up, 100% of Bitcoin hash power actually secures the finality of transactions.
What does that mean exactly? Because I read this exact same sentence that you just said. And what does it mean for 100% of Bitcoin hash power to secure Stacks transactions?
So basically, I think the simplest example is, let's say you do a transaction in Stacks. You get some confirmations. After a certain time has passed, and we can get into exactly how much time that is in blocks and confirmations. If someone wants to now fork Stacks, the layer, and say that I'm going to reorder it, right? So that's the security. That's traditionally when people think about security, when you're thinking about, hey, what's the security of Bitcoin? It's about how much money is required to go and fork the chain so that you can reorder it. So to do that sort of an attack on Stacks and come in and say, hey, I'm going to fork the chain, I'm going to reorder it, how much power is required? The answer is exactly the same as Bitcoin, because you will literally have to go and fork the Bitcoin L1 to be able to fork the history of Stacks. So that's the security property. And I think a lot of people think
Is that because you, I guess, continuously write the data from Stacks into the Bitcoin layer 1 blockchain? Whatever that's written onto the layer 1 blockchain is the source of truth.
So it's both, right? So the first thing is that if you're doing transactions on Stacks, they automatically are hashed as part of consensus, every Bitcoin block, and they're written to Bitcoin. We call that Bitcoin settlement. People who are more familiar with the rollups, it's sort of like saying your rollup root is like published automatically on the L1, as part of consensus. But then there's a next step, because you could do that and still have a separate security budget for the layer, right? Because in terms of forking and reorgs, you could have a different security budget. But what Stacks is doing in the next version is the security budget is exactly the same as Bitcoin L1. So someone who wants to come in and actually create like a deep fork after Bitcoin finality is reached would have to literally reorg Bitcoin. So that's where the security property comes from, that I can't reorder a transaction back in history after a certain point without actually attacking Bitcoin L1. When you get into things like that, a lot of people go like, wait a minute, so the consensus runs on L1. I'll have to attack L1 to be able to attack the layer, right? I can use my L1 assets in Stacks. And then there's another difference where most of the assets in Ethereum or Solana are issued on the L1. That's not the case in Bitcoin, right? The assets are actually issued on the layer, because Bitcoin doesn't really have support for full expressive contracts So if someone is trying to start USDC, it's not like USDC is issued on L1 and you're trying to move it to L2. It's actually issued on the L2 itself. So there's no concept of trying to withdraw USDC from the layer to the base layer.
Except for Ordinals, the NFTs on Ordinals, they are native to layer 1.
Yes. So Ordinals, I think the way I look at this is, think of that as Bitcoin L1 space is very, very precious, very, very prime, probably is like severely undervalued right now. And over time, we're already seeing like a rough 7 to 10x increase in Bitcoin fees since Ordinals started. And it's been like 4 or 5 weeks since it started. I fully expect fees to go up a lot more. So I think it will become like a lot of prime NFTs or really valuable NFTs would actually live on L1. But there's no way in hell that millions of NFTs can ever live on L1. Right? So if you're doing large mints, they will happen on layers. And so, yes, ordinals from L1, they can be sort of like moved into the layer along with your BTC probably, but most of the assets would be native to the layers.
I had a follow-up question earlier, which is the consensus. Stacks uses a proof of transfer consensus. Maybe talk a bit about what that is. How do miners spend BTC to receive Stacks? How does that flywheel work?
And why does Stacks need a token? So a very related question. Why is the token?
Yeah. So next question is like why Stacks needs a token. Yeah,
I'll get into that. Right. So just want to make it like absolutely clear that the Ethereum L2 definition, I actually agree with it. I think it's a very precise definition. And to be crystal clear, according to that definition, Stacks would not be a true L2. Right. And then we went over how it's not really a sidechain either. And that's why we prefer the term Bitcoin layer. With that said, a lot of the average people will end up calling it an L2. So they should just expect it, right? People have that like mental framework, and especially in the Bitcoin community, most things built on top of Bitcoin, people loosely use that term. So with that said, let's get into like why token, which is again, like this is not a criticism that comes from the Ethereum or other communities. This is the Bitcoin community that would really ask you that question that, hey, why do you need a token? And how does the system work?
Yeah.
So in terms of like the token, I think the reasoning is actually very, very simple. Because if you want to build a open and decentralized system, you have to have incentives, right? So if you want to incentivize people so that they can mine, and we can actually compare it to Liquid, which is again a Bitcoin layer, which whatever you want to call it. I would call it a federated sidechain, but some people call that a L2 as well. And for Liquid, it is a federation because Blockstream and the designers, they really wanted to optimize for not having a token. So once you actually sit down and you try to design a system, how would you build it? How would you build a network? Someone has to operate the network. Someone has to sort of like run it. Someone has to be in control. And if you don't have a token, you don't have any incentives. Then the way it works is that you're trusting a group of entities. They control how the network runs. And not only that they control mining operations, they also control the peg, right? So when you're actually transferring BTC to Liquid, you get LBTC on the other side. That's a Bitcoin-derived asset. You're putting 100% of the trust in that pre-selected group of companies, is Blockstream and a couple of others, that when I ask for my BTC back, this trusted group will send it back. Right? Now, let's say you want to design a different system that is actually open and decentralized. Anyone can become a miner. Anyone can become a signer. Right? How would you design it? I think that's where the token comes in. That's where the incentives come in, because it's a free-floating asset. The protocol is issuing it. Anyone who wants to come and become a miner, they can become a miner. Anyone who wants to be the signer for the peg out transaction, they can do that, right? So that's the simplest reason for why the token exists, and that takes us to mining. Like, how does mining work? So we had a pretty, I think, interesting mechanism where we wanted to basically benefit from proof of work without sort of like repeating the work itself. And we wanted to be as tightly coupled with the security of Bitcoin L1 as possible. So the system that we have designed is to think of that as once BTC is actually minted through proof of work, and keep in mind, I'm not getting into the proof of work versus proof of stake arguments. We are coming from a world where we think proof of work is very, very secure, and it's a great thing to be able to reuse proof of work security. Right. So once BTC is minted through proof of work, it's sort of like a digital representation of the work that was done. Right. And if now I'm using BTC to bid in mining, let's say there's an open auction where people are bidding in BTC, it's sort of like a proxy proof of work. These people have done the proof of work to actually get the BTC, and now they're trying to bid. Instead of like spending electricity, they're spending BTC. And that's how the mining for the Stacks layer is working. Compare that to mining on the Bitcoin L1. You're basically spending electricity, and you have some probability of becoming the leader to write the next block. On Stacks, people are spending BTC, so that's your money spent. Like your money's gone from your pocket, just like electricity bill that you have to pay, and you get a probability based on like how much you're spending, and given the probability function, you get selected as a leader, and the leader basically writes the block. And the way you write Stacks blocks is Stacks has a separate ledger, the separate layer ledger, and that is hashed to BTC. But all of the consensus, where people bidding with BTC and the miner election, everything happens with Bitcoin L1.
So that's the supply side of the STX token. But you must have also designed demand for STX as well, right? Like, meaning, what can you use STX for?
Yeah, so right now, like, you basically pay gas fees in STX, and you can lock. So that's a very interesting property, that you can actually lock STX in consensus to earn the BTC rewards. So the BTC that's coming in from mining, it's sort of like saying that the electricity, if there was a magical way to reuse electricity that's being burned on BTC mining and just give them to the homes of the people who own BTC, right? So it's sort of like that. Like, BTC is coming in, but instead of destroying BTC, like unlike electricity that gets destroyed, the protocol recycles the BTC and gives it to the people who are locking their STX in consensus, and they basically help consensus by doing that. The main purpose for this, which is not live yet, is SPDC. Right? So SPDC is ongoing work, and what would happen is that these folks who are locking up capital in consensus, they will become the signers for the peg out transaction. So they're doing useful work for the network. They're basically the signers, the decentralized group of signers that are providing the service, and they earn the BTC rewards. So STX is sort of like used for incentives, used as gas, and a bunch of it, I mean, right now something like $300 million is locked in dollars is locked in consensus for providing services to the protocol and earning rewards.
What are the services exactly? Do they just sign transactions, stake Bitcoin? Like, what? I think there are a couple properties there, right?
Yeah, the main thing moving forward is going to be maintaining the SBTC peg out.
Okay.
Right. So instead of relying on a federation, what you're saying is these people are putting up capital and they have BTC rewards at stake. So if they don't behave properly, first, their rewards would be cut off. Next, their capital would basically just stay locked there until they can properly sign the peg out. So in comparison, on a federation, you're sort of like completely trusting the federation. Over here, it's an open system. Anyone can come in, become a signer, and they have capital at stake. Right? So if they don't behave, their cap.
So conceptually, it's how a lot of Ethereum or other cross-chain bridges work with those economic
TBTC
security guarantees.
That's correct. And I think the main difference here is that we were able to secure this peg at the consensus level. Right? So it's fully embedded in the layer. It would be as if, this might feel like a strange analogy, but the analogy would be that for some reason Ethereum said, Bitcoin is a really good money asset, and we really want to bring BTC over to Ethereum. So the staking that people are doing for ETH, that was actually for pegouts signatures. Right? So a ton of capital and a ton of like decentralized group of people, they're optimizing for this one thing that we want to bring BTC over and make sure that in a decentralized way, BTC can go back. And obviously, that's not going to happen on the Ethereum side, but Stacks is effectively trying to do that.
I want to touch on two things. I know we're almost at time here. One is I was reading through the white paper and I saw subnets. And subnets is something within the Stacks ecosystem that can support EVM and Ethereum. What does that mean exactly? And how is this like your way of supporting Ethereum and other EVM-based blockchains?
Yeah, so it's a scalability mechanism, right? So the way to think about it is because Bitcoin L1 is so simple, like it's very basic, like money protocol, right? And the Stacks layer basically adds a programming layer to it. Ethereum has both kind of like collapsed into the L1. But then Ethereum saw a bunch of scalability solutions, right? Like rollups and all of these things. So subnets are sort of like the starting of these scalability solutions. So initially you can have more permission things, but then there's already some early work on fraud proofs or ZK rollups that's coming up, which will become very interesting, especially with SBDC. So you're moving SBDC into the Stacks layer to make it programmable, participate in DeFi, borrow stablecoins from it, and so on. And for scalability of even the Stacks layer itself, you could then move SBDC into a rollup. And one of the benefits there is we fully realize that there are a lot of programmers who know Solidity, for example, or who might know Rust, and they don't know Clarity. And we don't want that to be a bottleneck in the long run. We absolutely believe in Clarity because of the safety properties, but I think the safety properties are more meaningful at the Stacks layer, like where a lot of capital is coming in. SBDC contract, for example, is written in Clarity and so on. So if some people want Solidity because they already know how to use it, they could do that in a subnet or they could do that in a rollup.
Muneeb, on that note, I saw a very good question from one of the founders. The question goes, what is the difference between building on top of Ethereum L2 versus building on top of Stacks? I think you already mentioned a few points. One is the security versus expressiveness trade-off. And another one, which is more obvious, is simply that Stacks is a lot earlier than Ethereum rollups. And as a result, probably more opportunities. But what are some of the other major technical or cultural differences between building on top of Ethereum versus Stacks?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I agree that Stacks is much earlier. So the way I look at this is Bitcoin is like roughly $500 billion of capital, and all of these L2 / side chains, however you classify them, are barely like $1 or $2 billion market right now. Whereas on Ethereum is roughly $250 billion, and the L2 sidechain market is, I think, just the public part might be 25 billion, but there's a private part to it, which might take the total market to like 40, 50 billion. So one would be just very early, and I think a much bigger untapped market. And I think the Ordinals analogy works really well, that as soon as Bitcoin NFTs really could happen, we saw a ton of interest, and both from developers, from collectors, from artists, and so on. And I don't think our industry has seen like a true Bitcoin DeFi moment, right? Like where a ton of BTC capital is actually flowing into a contract, getting locked and getting used. And I think that would just solidify that, BTC, it's almost like people joke about it. Hey, I've heard about Bitcoin DeFi so many times, it's never going to happen. But I think when it happens, people would pretty intuitively understand why it's important, just because of how big Bitcoin capital is and how decentralized it is. So I think that's sort of the opportunity. In terms of the differences, I do think that the quote unquote true L2 difference is very real, right? Like if you are building a rollup, it is dependent on the Ethereum security. And on the stack side, we will push for BIPs on the Bitcoin L1, but our expectation is that it's not going to happen within years. So for a while, you have this decentralized peg, and we'll try to make it as decentralized as possible. So we're coming as close to a true L2 as we can, and there's only as far as we can go without actually support from L1. And L1 support is going to be slow. We know that Bitcoin doesn't change that much. And I think the opcodes that we are asking for, it will take a while for them to come along. So I think from a purely technical security point of view, that's one difference. From a culture standpoint, I would say that you would find a small but very thriving and very excited community of new Bitcoin builders, the new wave that is. So you'll feel this excitement of being part of like a new community. But always remember, there are those old grumpy people in Bitcoin that are not going to like what you're doing, and they will just yell at you, and that's fine. I think we can ignore it, and we can even help guide new developers how to deal with that.
Muneeb, thank you so much for your time. If developers want to find more about building on Stacks, what are some resources that you can point them to?
I think stacks.co, stacks.co is a good entry point into the ecosystem. One thing I didn't get to talk about much was the project decentralized a lot. Like when the mainnet happened, like it's almost like every early project member went off and did their own thing, and so
30,
people
right?
came.
Over
so
30 entities?
Yeah. It's like over 30 entities now.
Yeah.
It's like really like an open source project, very decentralized, but stacks.co is sort of like a high level entry point. And I think you can start finding information from there.
Great. Well, really appreciate your time, Muneeb.
Thank you, Muneeb.
All right. This was great. Thank you so much.
Lots to unpack with Muneeb just finishing up our session. We can unpack Muneeb as background, talk a bit more about Stacks and why it could be an incredible opportunity for founders, and then more or less where's the future going with Ordinals and some of the newer things that are coming out with Bitcoin. So you mentioned a bit about Muneeb.
Yeah, I have a lot of takeaways from the conversation, but the first key thing is about Muneeb himself. Like I said, I've known him for a while from Twitter, but never talked to him in person. So this was the first time. But he really strikes me as someone with a lot of humility and intellectual honesty. And he reminds me of two other people that I've spoken very highly about in the past, and that is Vitalik and Anatoly. I think all three of them share this quality of having high level of intellectual honesty and humility. So he specifically mentioned a few times that the Stacks layer, according to the Ethereum community's definition of layer 2, is not a true layer 2.
Yeah.
Despite facing all these like questions from the Ethereum community. I thought that was really...
But if you think about Muneeb, you have to withstand criticism over a long period of time. Like, I mean, when Vitalik left the Bitcoin community and started Ethereum, how much shit did he get? He got a lot, right? But, you know, he was really focused and on the journey, and he thought, you know, building expressive smart contracts is where it should be. Similar to Muneeb, I mean, Muneeb not only got shit from Bitcoin, but he also got shit from Ethereum.
That's right.
So you got to have this like internal resilience. And I think that is what makes a good, like very strong layer 1 founder.
Muneeb has probably gone through the most shit out of all the layer 1, layer 2 layers in all of crypto.
Yeah.
Two strong camps of opposition from internally from Bitcoin and then externally from Ethereum. So really
kudos to him for that.
I mean, more concretely on Stacks and Ordinals themselves. So Muneeb mentioned that the fees that are paid to Bitcoin miners are up 10x since Ordinals.
Yep.
Surprisingly, I didn't see that in my research. Maybe we use different methodology or different data sources. What I've seen is the average block size has gone up a lot from 1 megabyte to 2 megabytes. I didn't see the same thing about fees.
I saw it on Twitter. A lot of people posted how much minting fees occurred on Ordinals, upwards of $1 million. But I'm not sure how that translates to like Bitcoin transaction fees. So maybe there could be two different elements here.
Yeah. But either way, I think Muneeb agrees that there's going to be two important factors or contributors to a thriving fee market in Bitcoin, which we talked about the importance of which earlier. But the first thing is Ordinals. It really brings more interest from developers.
It does.
And building applications on top of the Ordinals protocol and generating fees. And the second one is Stacks itself, which is people building applications on top of Stacks and paying fees to the underlying Bitcoin L1 blockchain to settle those transactions. So that's, I guess, not surprising, but it was a good confirmation from Muneeb.
I mean, just the idea, like if you think about Ordinals and how much value it's securing for Bitcoin in the long run for miners, I mean, it's incredible. 5 to 6x growth over the past couple weeks already. And if we think it's where we think it's going to go, I think it's going to continue to stay consistent for a longer period of time. I mean, I minted something on Ordinals and it was very easy. Like you upload an image and a couple other things, data points, and you pop it in, and within a few minutes, you know, you'll have some sort of confirmation. And so I do expect that to grow. And what was another interesting thing was the way they're rebranding NFTs into digital artifacts. The founder, Casey, made this very clear. I was listening to one of his podcasts earlier, and he said that, like, I'm not going to use the word NFTs because that reminds me of Ethereum and like all the stuff that happens there. And I think what we're building is something much bigger, which is like digital artifacts, right? Like being able to secure any arbitrary data and assigning it as Satoshi. And then that kind of opens up the space, right? The design space. Like what else could be built on this, or what else could be generated on this?
Honestly, I don't know if that's a good rebrand. I think the entire world is
going to go with NFTs.
Yeah. Don't go against the crowd.
But you know, anyway. Bitcoin does that.
Yeah, that's right. But the one important thing that Muneeb mentioned about Ordinals is that, like, why is Ordinals a big deal? Like, this is the key question that we want to answer. Why is it a big deal? Well, it's a big deal because it's the start of a cultural shift.
Yeah.
In terms of how the world, especially developers, view Bitcoin. You can now do things on Bitcoin. You can actually build stuff on top of Bitcoin. And I've always had this thesis about Bitcoin. It's probably the first time I'm sharing my thesis about Bitcoin, is that there will be a smart contract ecosystem on top of Bitcoin. That smart contract ecosystem may not be as diverse as Ethereum. It may not do as many sets of applications or types of applications as Ethereum does, but there will be one. And it may also just be more semi-centralized than Ethereum, but there will be one just because there's $500 billion worth of Bitcoin, or $500 billion worth of value stored on the Bitcoin blockchain. And people will want to find things to do with that value.
And they don't want to use wrap BTC either, because there is a custody risk.
Exactly. And Ordinals, if this whole smart contract thesis, semi-centralized, less diverse than Ethereum, but still a thriving smart contract ecosystem thesis plays out on Bitcoin, now is the time, now is the moment, now is the defining moment, because you have Ordinals creating a cultural shift in how the world views Bitcoin. And you also have, of course, Stacks that have been working on gathering smart contract developers for at least a couple of years now.
I feel like the way they build Stacks is in parallel to Bitcoin, right? It doesn't like overtake anything of what Bitcoin does. It works,
and they can because the maxis won't do anything.
They'll hate it. But even then, like, being able to mine like transaction hashes go on Bitcoin Stacks actively listens for Bitcoin transactions that have to do with Stacks, and then executing the smart contract execution, SBTC pegged to BTC. I feel like all of those kind of areas of opportunities that Stacks has built will ultimately help grow the adoption of Bitcoin in the long run for those that don't want to leave Bitcoin ecosystem. And maybe it's not now, maybe it'll be in a couple of years from now, but eventually Bitcoin will need to figure out its fee situation. And Ordinals is one way of doing it, but I also think Stacks and other layer 2s that are being built around it will also be a defining moment for Bitcoin when it comes to like securing the network.
All the stars are aligned right now. If it ever happens, it's now. Now is the defining moment.
Yep. So we'll see where it goes in the next couple of years. And maybe we could do a recap in 12 months to see whether or not progress is made and success and et cetera.
And by the way, one of the best ways, I think, for anyone in this industry, be it developers or users or investors or whatever, to understand a consumer-facing product deeply is to actually try the products. It's not pulling shit out of your ass out of nowhere. Yeah. It's to actually try the products, try the Ordinals, play around with the NFTs, and play around with Stacks. Use the wallet that Muneeb mentioned, which is Xverse. I've used it myself. Really great product. But just try it. Just try the product and then get a sense of how real this thing is.
I would also say talk to the founders that are building those ecosystems. I mean, there's so many great founders that are building around the Stacks ecosystem, one of which is a part of our program for this upcoming batch. And so I think that will give you a lot of clarity on why people are building in the ecosystem. We talked to one other co-founder recently, you and I, Qiao. And we asked him why, and he said it is an asymmetric bet. It's an asymmetric bet that Bitcoin over time will become a thriving ecosystem for founders, and people will want to do something with their Bitcoin, and that's why he's making that bet. And the founders are incredible, right? Like, I mean, they're coming from like very strong backgrounds that are building the space. It's not just a developer; it's like an enthusiast per se, but they're really, really strong founders that are thinking about actively building real products on Bitcoin or Stacks ecosystem.
What gives me assurance about founders building on top of Bitcoin is that in this day and age, if you're building on top of Bitcoin, you're not someone who follows the herd, follows the latest hype or narrative. Yeah. You're someone who's actually intellectually and ideologically aligned. And I'm confident that you're going to be here in the long term. So that's what gives me assurance about the Bitcoin founders.
I mean, if you think about it, like even us doing this podcast on Bitcoin is probably controversial.
That's right.
Because look, every podcast that's out, that's like going live today, all the sessions are on Blur. Every article that I'm getting from every publication is about Blur. And here we are doing a podcast around Bitcoin. And so that kind of gives you an idea of like how we see the space. And, there are some defining moments that may not be talked a lot about in the community. And I think that those are the reasons why we talk about it is to kind of look the other way when others are looking more on the crypto narrative side.
That's it. You've said everything I wanted to say.
Yep. Thanks, guys, for listening. Hit subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll see you for episode 13.
Take care, guys.
Thanks for listening to Good Game. Don't forget to subscribe. We'll see you next week.